I'm Julie Brill, and I wrote a book called Hidden in Plain Sight, a family memoir and the untold story of the Holocaust in Serbia. Starting from when I was a young child, maybe 3 or 4, my father told me his stories of surviving the Holocaust as a young child himself in Belgrade, Serbia. It was like one child talking to another. He was 3 or 4 when these stories happened, and he had these very specific memories. He told me about running from the German bombs with his mother down the street and the sound the bombs made. He told me about coming back after the bombing and seeing a plate of cookies that my grandmother had the foresight to put on a wardrobe, and the vibrations from the bombs had dropped the plate on the floor and it had shattered in two. My toddler father was fascinated with this. Why didn't the plate shatter? Why was it just broken in two? I absorbed these stories of the Holocaust in Serbia, and then as an older child, tried to match them with what had happened in the Holocaust we learned about. The one in Germany, in Poland, Anne Frank in Amsterdam, the one with cattle cars and distant camps. I almost thought that the Holocaust hadn't happened to my family in Belgrade because the stories were so different. In Belgrade, the Holocaust came very early and very sudden. By the spring of 1942, the Germans were already saying that Belgrade, the capital city, was Judenfrei, free of Jews. That was before Auschwitz even got going. I couldn't understand how my father had survived and how my grandmother had been able to visit my grandfather in a camp in the center of the city. There were no trains, there were no gas chambers, there were no cattle cars. I set out originally to write this story for my family, to be able to give the history back to my father and down to my children and my nephew and my niece. Then one day I was at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., in their vast bookshop, and there the books are arranged alphabetically by country. So I walked down to the end of the aisle because I wanted to see the books on Yugoslavia, and there were no books under Y for Yugoslavia. There had been no book written in English on the Serbian Holocaust. And that's when I knew that this book was not just for my family, that it was for the public, that it was important to know all these stories, to know the stories of what happened in Eastern Europe, to know about what happened to my grandfather, Alexander Brill, who was murdered in the way that most Jews in the Holocaust were murdered, not in distant camps, but close to where he lived, right in the capital city of Belgrade. When we were growing up, we had a few precious pictures of my father's childhood. We had one of him with his father when he was just a baby. We had one of him with his mother as a toddler, and we had the one that's on the cover of the book. In that picture, taken in the spring of 1943, he's standing on the street with his younger sister, my Aunt Shoshana. I could never understand how this picture could exist. How were these two Jewish children standing on the street of Belgrade after the city had been declared Judenfrei, free of Jews? As I learned more about the history of occupied Germany, it just became more mysterious because it was illegal for civilians to have cameras. You couldn't take a picture legally on the street anywhere in occupied Europe because you might accidentally or intentionally give away a German military secret. My grandmother somehow had the will, the force to get this picture taken of her children, remember film, to get it developed and to save it through the war. I think she was trying to one day show my grandfather when they were reunited what he had missed of his children's childhood. Of course, we now know the story through research that my grandmother never knew. My grandmother hoped until she died in the 60s that they would be reunited. But my grandfather was actually murdered on the day that he disappeared. The Germans had a horrible math equation that they did in Serbia where the rebellion was so strong. Every time one of the partisans, one of the Serbian guerrillas, murdered shot a German soldier, they killed 100 civilians. If the soldier was just wounded, it was 50 civilians. And they went through the camp that was in the city, the work camp where my grandfather was held, and shot at point blank firing squad all of these men, including my grandfather. So he actually, sadly, was murdered on the day that he disappeared. Through my research, we now have a yahrzeit date. We know the date that happened, and we can light a candle and say a prayer and remember him on that day in the Jewish tradition. I hope that you'll check out my book, Hidden in Plain Sight, to learn more about the Serbian Holocaust and my family story.